This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us today on this Friday's program, we start with K-State grain market economist Dan O'Brien. He provides the latest grain market update, where he covers the continuous strength in cash markets in the southeastern portion of the state and the effects of ongoing weather concerns. Also ahead, Sandy Johnson, K-State beef specialist, discusses nitrate concerns as a result of the persistent drought conditions across the state and considerations producers should be mindful of when deciding what to feed their cattle. We end with this week's agricultural weather report from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. He covers what parts of the state received some much-needed rain and how that rain affected the drought monitor. That and more awaits us ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now for our weekly grain market update. And to do that, we have, as always, with us, Dan O'Brien. He's our grain market economist here at K-State. So, Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Samantha.
Dan, as we always do, let's go ahead and start with those future markets.
Well, tremendous day on the futures yesterday, on Thursday, August the 4th. Seen a lot of up and down volatility. Turned out that we had moderately strong corn prices, closed at, from where we dropped to prior in the week, we closed on the September contract up to 602 and a quarter. D's back up above $6 at 606 and a quarter, and those were up 10 3/4 and 10 cents per bushel. The big movement came in the soybean market. August soybean futures, again, now they're in the delivery time period of that. So, but it was at $16.15, up 57 cents. The September contract, which we've rolled over to largely now for determining cash price basis, once August got into delivery, closed at $14.61. That was also up 57.5 cents. Wheat has had a strong day also, up. September closed at $8.60, 60 and a quarter, up 24 3/4. D's 868, 24 and a fourth. So big news in the market has to do with weather on the one hand. Again, blocking high pressure system, kind of symptomatic of a La Nina weather year that's really affecting the availability of moisture, temperatures and moisture in the western Corn Belt in particular, and parts of Iowa, all coming into play. So the market is of two minds. It's trying to determine how much damage is in the west and how optimistic they are in the east, and trying to figure out where the center goes also. That's an ongoing issue for corn that's forecast for really pretty hot, dry conditions, at least by the weather maps that I'm looking at the National Weather Service, showing for a fair amount of August. Yeah, we'll have some sporadic moisture, but generally hot and dry. We're coming into August, and for soybean markets, you have some worry of August hot and dry conditions now coming in and affecting soybean futures, and that's part of what brought that 57 cent to the high side yesterday in these markets. The other part has to do with reports out of Argentina that as an inflation hedge in a really roiling, upset economy, which in Argentina seems to happen about once every decade or so, or two, that farmers, instead of selling soybeans, are holding that back as an asset for or capital for an inflation hedge. So to the degree that those Argentine farmers are holding their soybeans off the market, then that tightens things up and in terms of world trade, and eventually sends people back to the U.S. I think it's good to remember that right now the crop out of Brazil either has come out of the field or will be coming shortly, and Brazil will have strong exportable supplies, and so they're in front of us at this time, but there'll come a time probably out into September when their exportable supplies are pretty well used up, and the world will have to come to the U.S. Sure. So that really, I guess, brings to bear the idea of what cash markets will do in response once we come into harvest.
Sure. And speaking of those cash markets, I know last week we talked about some strength in the Southeast, and we're seeing that again this week. Is that right?
Especially in corn. So we've got kind of a tale of four major markets that we're watching on the cash side. And I really think anymore, if we want to get the pulse of these markets locally, yes, we're watching futures, and that's affecting us. But we see what grain elevators locally are doing with basis. It really gives us probably the best picture of how much demand pull there is coming out the countryside. On the corn side, generally the strong run-up that we've seen in corn basis over the last month and a half has pretty much maintained in most areas of the state, fallen off just a little bit, still very strong in the Northeast. In the Southeast, it's the only part of the state, at least amongst these major markets that we're watching. Again, Colby, Salina, Topeka, Garden City, Hutchinson, Columbus. Columbus, the Southeast area, is the only part of the state where the basis has actually gotten narrower yet, got stronger yet. So that's still in play. On the grain sorghum side, we haven't seen any weakness in basis, and that's consistent with this ongoing march in pretty decent grain sorghum export numbers. Some up and downs to be sure, but no weakness. But again, the strongest move in grain sorghum basis in the state has happened again in southeast Kansas. So you've got some of that demand pull coming out of the southeast as livestock feeders are trying to pull in what supplies they can, and pretty dry conditions, not the best conditions in parts of that world. I would say for soybeans, for as strong as corn has been, if anything, in the last few weeks, soybeans has been stronger in terms of basis, but it's really been bouncing around. I think affected here of late by what we were just talking about earlier for the soybean market. Really high set since 2018. I say highs in terms of the narrowest basis levels set in Colby area is slightly higher than last year. It happened earlier in the marketing year. Highest in Salina, highest in the Topeka area. Definitely highest in Columbus, highest in Hutchinson, pretty strong in Garden City. Again, Garden City is more of a feed grain area. They do grow some soybeans, but even there they have pretty strong basis. So strong moves. And if you look at on the export side, we have a good amount of soybeans bought ahead for delivery nationally into the next market year. So perhaps these elevators are getting ready for what they anticipate to be a pretty strong demand pull once we actually get a harvestable grain. Of course, the current basis would be trying to pull in anything they have right now, and we'll see where that goes later. And we have pretty strong, pretty healthy biodiesel demand or renewable diesel coming out of soybeans. So that's probably at play too. Should mention on wheat, we've got decent basis. We have, I guess, for wheat after we've had the harvest that we've had and the things that we're wondering about. When you look at wheat basis levels, you do see some improvement that's been happening in the Colby area. Recent improvement down in Hugoton, steady. Salina, Hutchinson, pretty steady in Topeka, Columbus. So if anything, the stronger basis moves, relatively speaking, been happening in the western part of the state. So interesting to watch. And pull all that together, and we still have wheat cash prices ranging across the state at these major locations, running from $7.85 in the southeast, widest basis, everything else above $8, ranging up to about $8.45 on the high side in Salina and Hutchinson. And corn cash prices, a lot of variability. In Garden City at $7.72, Colby $7.42, and southeast Kansas $7.67, almost as high as Garden City. And other decent prices as well. So lots to watch, I guess, in these markets. And I think it really sets us up for ongoing volatility for the month of August as we see this weather play out, as we see these uncertainties on the world market play out. And when we get to this time of the year, Samantha, so often we're wondering, well, do we start now this slow slide down into harvest? With prices anticipating larger supplies coming on and a weakening at that time. I think in almost every situation we'd expect that, unless say for corn, the damage from all the weather extremes that we faced this summer end up and give us a corn crop of 14 billion or something less than that. And then you probably find yourself in a short crop situation where you have very strong basis as people scramble to get hold of anything that's available. And again, you get an inverted market where we're showing things pretty strong at the front side. So am I predicting that? No, but that risk is out there with these uncertainties we have in crop size. So very interesting time to be looking at. I think you and I have talked about this. Some of our biggest risk has to do with overall financial market impacts of worries, pessimism, whatever, come out of those markets and affect the commodities. And then you see that bleed over, kind of wash over into the grains and have some downward effect on those too.
It's interesting. You talk about kind of that consumer index that we talk about a lot, but I guess the farmers index, there's a similar one just for producer outlooks as well. And I saw that was recently up in July.
I think there's one out of Purdue that yes, it gives a farmers' optimism or pessimism. And interesting to hear that it's optimistic. Of course, it's probably more optimistic in Indiana where they've gotten some rain than it is right now in Kansas where we haven't gotten so much. That'd be my only caveat of that. But I don't think anybody's pessimistic about prices. On our side, we'd wonder about having the quantity of crops to sell into these markets.
Sure, the supply to back up that demand for sure. With all things considered, we mentioned the volatility of this market, but that cash market, not too bad where we're currently sitting. But as you mentioned, going into the rest of the month, that may change. So something to look out for, that guess of under 14 billion bushels potentially for corn. And in terms of some private forecasts that you've been looking at, is that kind of what they're showing?
Well, on the corn side, whereas the USDA had projected a U.S. average corn price of 177 bushels per acre, there's some independent analysts projecting about 174. Interestingly, there was a farm futures survey that came out not that long ago where they asked farmers online what they thought they'd have, and they were a little more optimistic than the 174, say 175, 176. I think I don't want to belittle anyone. I think if you're growing the crop, you're always hoping for the best, and you're not going to declare it really poor until you actually have to. So I think there's some natural leanings there in those numbers. But one thing that's consistent is that I guess it'd be really surprising if we actually ended up with what the USDA is projecting right now. And at 177, it seems that we're heading either optimistic or pessimistic views at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bushels lower than that. And that takes us off of 14.5 billion bushels down closer to 14. And then we start to really wrestle with just how tight we'll allow ending stocks to get and what prices we have to go to ration things out.
Once again, that was Dan O'Brien. He's a grain market economist here at K-State. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Sandy Johnson. She's a K-State Extension beef specialist, and she's joining us again this week to talk about nitrate accumulation concerns that we're really having across the state at this point.
Yes, certainly, especially where I'm located in Colby in northwest Kansas. Drought is a regular occurrence, but it's even more so this year. It's dry early, and we know that whenever plants' growth is kind of slowed or stopped, we can get nitrate accumulation. It's trying to use that nitrogen to build plant tissue. We get lack of moisture very commonly, so that nitrogen is just kind of hung up in the base of the plant, waiting for, moisture to lift it higher in the plant. You might think about it. Plant physiologists might get a little on my description, but that's the crude way.
So that's basically the cause of this concern, really, is just the little precipitation that we've gotten across the state. Is that correct?
Right. We can have other types of injuries to plants, say from hail, or even some real high dry winds can cause some stress to the plant that essentially, reduces its ability to grow. But, drought is certainly the biggest one.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the key thing there, but that nitrate accumulation really happens towards the base of the plant. Is that correct?
Right. If we're looking at forages we might use for livestock, then it's important to know where that nitrate concentration is the highest. And that is certainly in the base of the plant. And the leaves generally are not a problem, but they can be if the plant is extremely high. For example, I just sampled some weeds last week, and the top 12 inches or so of either kochia or Palmer amaranth had essentially deadly levels of nitrates. So,
wow.
Generally the leaves aren't a problem, but if the plant is really an accumulator and the conditions are right, the entire plant can be just really hot.
Sure. And conditions for a lot of the state right now are certainly, I think, like you said, just perfect for that accumulation to occur. And that's led to a lot of concerns for producers. You've been getting a lot of questions lately about concerns over nitrate toxicity and things like that. So tell us a little bit about that.
So where we are in northwest Kansas, we're really limited on our pastures were slow and we didn't get much moisture. So people are looking at what can I do now? Because the pasture is running out, or it will be soon. And so as they look at this corn, dryland corn that's not doing much, they're thinking about grazing that, in some cases trying to make silage. And so if we just kind of talk about those two options, if we think we want to graze some dryland corn, we certainly would want to take a good sample before grazing. Nitrates can be highly variable, and so we want to sample. We also know that nitrates can increase again after a rain. So last week we had some spotty showers around. Some people got some really good rains. And so as that plant sees this moisture and it gets all excited, and it's going to grab more nitrogen from the soil, and it may be even higher than it was before the rain. So understand the timing of your sample and how the current conditions are impacting. So it can go higher, but oftentimes we can graze lightly on a high nitrate possible forage like corn. Wouldn't want to force them to graze down to the ground, and probably we want to leave some good residue anyway. But as you think about doing that, you'd want to sample what you think the animal might be eating, as well as, how long are you going to leave them on in that field? Are you going to just kind of let them pick the leaves and the candy, so to speak, or are you going to make them eat the vegetables? So we've got to manage that if we're going to graze something that's potentially high in nitrates. We're going to harvest it. We have some options. If we cut it, we're going to put it in a bale. If we cut it higher, we're going to leave more of that nitrogen from that lower part of the plant in the ground. If we make it into silage, that process will reduce the amount of nitrates roughly 50%. So that's a good option. When we're this short on forage, people want to get every bit of it they can often. So you want to, understand the trade-offs between that cutting height and your tonnage and, the package you're going to put it in. And I might be more inclined to cut it lower than if I was harvesting for silage, because one, it's going to reduce, and two, that stalk is going to get chopped up, and I probably get a better utilization out of that lower part of that stalk from a nutrient standpoint and feed waste than I would in a bale of some form. So you got to think about all those options of how you're going to harvest it and use it. And then if we have, say, a baled forage that's higher in nitrates, we're able to grind that and mix it. We can dilute it and still make good use of it. However, I have seen bales that are hot enough that we don't have the ability to, it's not practical for you to feed a small enough amount of it to mix it in a ration. Testing is our friend to figure out what you have, and you want to think about what part of the plant you're going to use and test that, and recognize then the variability that might occur across the field based on soil type or terraces where there's more moisture there, whatever. Understand your field and how that can impact nitrate concentrations as well.
Sure. So a few follow-up questions on that. You mentioned, testing is the best thing that a producer can do in this situation, just to really know what they're dealing with. So what are some best practices when it comes to testing? You mentioned there's variability. So should a producer be taking samples every acre, or?
That's a good question. And number one, you can't take too many. All right. And what I have done sometimes, depending on what the situation is, we might take a couple of types of samples. So if we're thinking about grazing some of it, we may, depending on how tall the plant is, maybe we're going to sample the top 6 inches. So we have a little bit of stalk and a little bit of leaf. We also may want to sample different parts of the field. Some of the fields we've sampled, there's some of it doesn't look too bad. Some of it's quite a bit worse. And it's not always clear to me why those differences are. But we sample those different ones to try and understand what's out there. And then, at a minimum, if you're looking at whole plant samples, you can take, not knowing the size of the field, the more the better, but, 10 to 15 plants that you sampled, trying to represent your entire field. And depending on the size of the field, you may want to sample. I feel like I've sampled the east side, and I'm going to, go to another portion of it to feel like you've represented that field. But take as many as you can stand to take, and then if you're going to send those in somewhere, you can try and chop those up as fine as you can, mix it, and subsample a smaller amount to take in. But it does present some challenges trying to evenly subsample that, depending on how well you've got it chopped up. And I won't say that this is a perfect world when it comes to sample some of these things, but the more you do and the more precise you are, the better off your information will be.
Sure, and some information is better than none, of course. And then one of those other follow-up questions I had was, creating silage takes time, obviously. And right now, like you said, a lot of the state is in some pretty desperate conditions because of a lack of forage. So sometimes, while silage is better in terms of decreasing the amount of nitrate that is in that feed, sometimes grazing really is the immediate option that some of these producers have. So if producers are deciding to ultimately graze and they haven't had the time to test, what are some of those symptoms of nitrate toxicity that we can look out for in our cattle?
Yeah, so essentially what happens is the result of the toxicity is the lack of oxygen. And so they may start acting funny and wandering around, and they're going to be more heat stressed because of the lack of oxygen. You know, a lot of times you just find a dead animal. That's what you see. You do need to recognize that if you're looking at fall calving cows and have late-term pregnancies right now, nitrate can cause abortion. Might not kill the cow, but can cause them to lose that fetus. So that's important to consider, you know, how you use that high nitrate feed. When we think about using some of these feeds, some people suggest sending out a tester animal, and, you know, so that's not your favorite cow. That's the one that had bad behavior last time. But, you know, that's still kind of risky to do. And if you're going to use this tester animal approach, why then, you know, you need to recognize you got to monitor that closely and see what's going on. And not the best approach in my mind, but some people recommend that. So,
I mean, if someone's sending out a tester animal, then they might as well have the time to go out and sample and send off those samples too as well.
Right. The value of the tester is they're doing the selection and not you.
True.
And we always have trouble mimicking what they eat. We've proven that before in other studies. So I understand why people look at it that way. But, you know, it's a challenging issue to deal with, but we tend to have nitrate concerns every year. This year, I think they're just heightened, and people just need to make sure they're doing their testing, and if they have any questions about what or how or anything with that sampling, our local county offices or those of us on the state and the area offices, we're here to help you. And it's sometimes easy to get nitrates and prussic acid confused and those symptoms, and please don't hesitate to call us if we can help you make sure that you're being safe in what your plan is.
Absolutely. And if listeners are tuning in and they're hoping for more information on nitrate concerns, you can find that in a recent Agronomy e-update, which will be linked in today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net. So look out for that as well. But Sandy, thank you so much for your time.
You bet. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Sandy Johnson. She's a K-State Extension beef specialist covering nitrate accumulation concerns. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back for our weekly agriculture weather report for the week. And to cover that, as always, we have with us K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. So, Chip, thanks for joining us.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Chip, let's start off with something that was, sort of good in the past week or so. Some of the state got some rain.
Yeah, sort of good is putting it lightly. Honestly, the Southwest is really where the most of the rain fell over the last 7 days, and it was badly needed. I know for a lot of locations it was just a drop in the bucket, but it was moisture nonetheless, and honestly more than some of them have seen since February. So
wow.
A good rain event. Some places got over 2.5 inches of rain. Highest locations were some lucky souls up in Cheyenne County. That's in the northwest. And then southwest and west central. So areas like Tribune got over 2 inches, 3 inches of rain. And then just really good widespread rain for that region.
Absolutely. And with that rain, that was much needed, like you mentioned, did that improve our drought monitor at all? Or are we still kind of in some bad conditions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Conditions in western Kansas are bad. They're in a prolonged drought. They've got anomalies for this time of year for up to 7 to 8 inches below normal. In fact, Garden City had its driest year on record as of last week. The rain has changed that a little bit now, where they're just like second to driest. So 2 inches was a big benefit in places. It did offset some of the longer-term deficits, but they average about an inch of moisture a week. So just assuming if we had normal conditions the last 2 weeks, that 2 inches would have basically offset the last 2 weeks. So really just short-term benefit. Moisture, it didn't really get deep down in the soil. They needed a longer duration rain event for that. There was some runoff in areas where it was heavy. So all that to say, not a lot of drought monitor improvement. We did basically improve things by category in a small area there from basically Greeley County down towards Kearney County. And that's just a small localized area where that heaviest rainfall fell. Other than that, really no big drought monitor changes this week. We get further east, they're averaging still about the same amount of precipitation during the week as the west. It's just that time of the year. But they continue to be really dry to the east. We did see some severe drought get introduced this week into eastern Sedgwick County and then southward to the Oklahoma border. That area and then eastward to the far southeast Kansas is extremely dry. With this last rain event, they got some light rain in the western part of that area, but other than that, very minimal moisture and some significant deficits are growing quickly for those folks in south central, southeast Kansas.
And as we continue on, I know that we have just some continued warm days ahead of us. So what has the week ahead really shown in terms of some 100-degree days across the state?
Yeah, we've basically plateaued for seasonality for warm temperatures. That was basically the last week of July is when we have the warmest average temperatures of the year. Through August, we go through this gradual trend where the average temperatures start falling off by a degree or two a week. And that means our probability of getting more 100-degree days starts to decline a little bit just because of seasonality, but we still have maximum records in the hundreds through basically early September. So we're starting to tick off the average temperatures, but we're still expecting really warm temperatures. And I'd still expect some hundreds with as much. We've had this ridge of high pressure built back in across the central plains. That's taken all the moisture in the southwest, taking it north and then to our east, and basically taking it up and around the central plains. That's going to allow the atmosphere to dry out again, the soils to dry out again, and the heat to continue to gradually build. And we'll keep seeing 90s to 100s likely through the next week, if not even later into late August. And with that comes the precipitation chances as well, or I should say lack thereof. We've got really strong high pressure again. Since that moisture is going around us and we're building that heat, we just don't have the moisture we need to generate afternoon thunderstorms. Yeah, there'll be a couple of days of some scattered showers and storms, but overall, we won't be getting our average precipitation across most of the state, and those areas of rain will be very limited. We start to look at, our grasses, except for far northeast Kansas, have pretty much dried out across the state. Crops are starting to dry out, especially dryland corn is browning out in a lot of places. So we start to look at increased concerns of lightning with those thunderstorms and the potential for wildfires.
Well, definitely things to be mindful of for sure. But once again, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond for this week's Agricultural Weather Report. That concludes today's programming. We'll be back with more next week on Agriculture Today.